So, are you ready for my song and dance act? For those of you who don't know me, I'm Steve Bird. I'm a professor of political science, and I do a lot of work on energy policy around here. And I'd like to thank all of you for coming to Clarkson's first inaugural, our very first, Power and Energy Forum. This is going to be the first of planned once per semester events that will bring in, excuse me, I'm battling a cold, key players from the national and international realm in power and energy. Very quickly, I'd like to thank many of the folks responsible for making this happen. Carrie Capella in the President's office, Christina Lysick, our IT and administrative folks have all been really helpful. So thank you to them. And second, I want to mention this event has support and sponsorship from Provost Chuck Thorpe, the School of Arts and Sciences David A. Walsh Seminar Series, the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences, and the Institute for a Sustainable Environment. Following this talk, a reception will occur in the TAC atrium. Dr. Hart will be autographing copies of his book at this time, and you may have noticed some of the books for sale outside Science Center 360. So, enough with that stuff. Enough with the logistics. Dr. David Hart is a full professor in George Mason University's School of Public Policy. Last year, he served as Assistant Director for Innovation Policy at the Office of Science and Technology Policy while a fellow at the White House. However, I want to be very clear here to the folks who are watching from the National Security Council and the Department of Homeland Security that David Hart was not a White House fellow. I got into a lot of trouble from the White House because that is a branded term. David received his PhD in political science from MIT in 1995. He was a professor for 10 years at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government, and that's where I met him while I was a lowly grad student. He's a specialist in governance, American political history, immigration policy, and of course, innovation policy. In his 2013 State of the Union address, just last month or so, President Obama cited some of the manufacturing innovations that Dr. Hart collaborated on. In addition to numerous papers in some of the most prestigious academic journals, he's authored or co-authored 3 books based on innovation, entrepreneurship, the knowledge economy, science and technology policy, and most recently he co-authored with Richard Lester in 2011, Unlocking Energy Innovation, How America Can Build a Low-Cost, Low-Carbon Energy System. So why are we here and not at the Sex Bowl? David's work is absolutely critical to the grand challenges that the United States and indeed the world face in the 21st century. In the context of increased global geopolitical instability, global climate change, increased energy use, the government's role in the creation and management of innovation and scientific discovery are going to be critical as we move from a world population of currently 7 billion to 8 billion in 2025. And Dave, I'm expecting you to fix all of this in the next 60 minutes or so. It's my great pleasure to introduce Professor David Hart.
Well, thanks, Stephen. It's great to be here. I had a wonderful day, and I really appreciated meeting faculty and students, and I want to express my particular appreciation to the President and to Provost Thorpe, who I had the pleasure of serving with at the White House. One of the really nice things about working there was getting to know him. And I'm really pleased to see you all tonight. It's pretty intimidating knowing that I'm up against the Sex Bowl, that you all could have been there rather than here. So someone will have to tell me what that is. But right now, it's just a figment of my imagination, which makes it, all the more exciting, I think. So this work, as Steve mentioned, is joint work with Richard Lester from MIT. We had a terrific team of grad students, both from MIT and George Mason, that worked on it. We had a very eminent advisory board, some of whom vehemently disagreed with the conclusions. And so all the conclusions are ours, Richard and mine, not attributable to them or to the White House or to anybody else, but just ours. And it was work that was supported by the Duke Charitable Fund, the Doris Duke Charitable Fund. And as Stephen mentioned, it was finished in the summer of 2011, in fact, right right before I went into the White House. And the White House being what it is, they told me, well, what do you know about? Well, I know about energy policy. I know about immigration policy. And they said, no, sorry, you can't work on that. You're going to work on manufacturing. So that's what I did for the last year. And now I've come back out of the tunnel that is the White House, where there's 24/7 things to do. And I've been catching up a little bit on energy policy. And my impression is that things haven't changed a whole lot. The news isn't really good. We haven't had legislation related to climate and energy. In fact, the stimulus funding, which was substantial, has basically run out. We've seen international negotiations basically deadlock. On the other hand, there are some encouraging signs on the horizon. So Resources for the Future recently projected that the US has a pretty good chance of meeting the 17% reduction in CO2 emissions relative to 2005 that the president called for, so 2020 relative to 2005. We may be able to hit that 17% target. And of course, the president made some encouraging remarks in the second inaugural address, which I think came as something of a surprise that he would hit that theme, the climate theme, so strongly. But I think, as all of you know, there are a lot of alarming signals that the climate is sending us, that the environment is sending us. Arctic sea ice is melting, permafrost is melting. We still get over 80% of our energy from fossil fuels. And we have a highly inefficient energy use infrastructure. So we have a long ways to go. In writing the book, our idea was that this debate needed some new ideas. There are a lot of ideas out there, but they tend to be held by people who are sort of one-trick ponies. So you have some people who think, well, the answer is new technology. If we would just pump a lot of money into R&D out of your labs, I hope some of you will be involved in some of that R&D. I hope some of you guys make the breakthroughs that we need. But even if we have breakthroughs in the lab, that's not going to be enough. Kind of the extreme version of that is we need a Manhattan project, or we need 10 Manhattan projects, or we need 10 Apollo projects. Then you have the economist view, which is, well, let's just price carbon. Let's put a tax on CO2 emissions. Let's build a cap and trade program. Either way you do it, it puts a price on carbon, and that will drive the solution. There are other people who say, what we have is an incredibly inefficient government structure. Chuck and I had a chance to experience that close up. You get, and other people here have experience with that too, get up close and personal with the Department of Defense, Department of Energy, and you realize, yes, there is something to this point. And then finally, you have people who say Americans are just energy hogs. If you all would just stop building such big houses, driving such big cars, we could solve this problem. And they're all right. There's something to all these points of view. The problem is they're not really willing to acknowledge one another and to think about a broader, more comprehensive view. And if you think I'm joking, here is a statement by the most eminent energy economist. To a first approximation, raising the price of carbon is a necessary and sufficient step for tackling global warming. The rest is all fluff. If you can just get prices right, that will solve the problem. Well, Richard and I looked at this, and we don't think so. And in particular, we know that there's a lot of innovation that's needed to solve these energy challenges, to meet the challenge of the 21st century, which in our mind preeminently is the climate challenge. And very few of the folks who are writing about this really are thinking about innovation in a systematic way. So all these views have something to them. All of them are incomplete. And typically, they're not very well informed about how innovation works. So our goal, as I said in the previous slide, try to expand the menu, try to think systematically about innovation. And I think what we came out with was sort of a vision statement. I don't think it has all the answers. I don't think it's a completely comprehensive book. Otherwise, it would be a lot longer than it is, because many of you are involved in details. And the devil is going to be in the details here. So this is a big picture. But I hope we're asking the right question. So this is the question that we tried to ask. What kind of innovation system does the United States need to build in order to accelerate the transition to an affordable, reliable, low-carbon energy economy? And by system, I mean something much more than policy. Policy itself isn't the solution. So when we say system, we mean a set of institutions. We mean companies, big companies and small companies. We mean government agencies at the federal level, at the state level, at the local level. We mean research institutions like the one here, but at many other levels and scales. All of these institutions have an important role to play. If you look at the parts of our economy that are really innovative, the information technology sector, the biotechnology sector, these are systems that work pretty well, and you have a bunch of institutions that fit together and interact very effectively. But for energy, energy has a different set of challenges, and in energy, the innovation system doesn't work very well. So while we may have not given the right answer, and I certainly expect plenty of challenges from this audience, and I doubt that we have all the answers, I hope we asked the right question. If we did that, and we get people thinking about expanding the menu to encompass the notion of innovation system, then I think the book is successful. So here's the table of contents, and I'll just try to hit the high points tonight and take you through that. And I certainly welcome your feedback, your criticism, your ideas. And again, I hope the next generation is going to have to carry this on, and I know many of you are engaged in a variety of different kinds of projects that address it. So the first chapter, Beyond Wishful Thinking, Facts, Deductions, and Grounded Assertions about Climate and Energy. I think we have to stop arguing about this particular fact. The fact is the climate is changing. I think there's a consensus on that, and I'm troubled by the direction that the public debate is going. We see efforts to so-called teach the controversy about global warming, like teach the controversy about evolution. Are we going to teach the controversy about gravity? I hope not. So I think we should stop arguing about this. Climate is, I think, the most important of the energy challenges, and it's time for us to tackle it. So the book begins with a set of very simple models for thinking about what needs to be done. So the president has proposed that the U.S. cut its carbon dioxide emissions by 80%. Hi, welcome. By 2050, so we call this the 80 and 40 challenge. So 80% relative to 2010 and 2050. There's a lot of different years and numbers flying around here, and it's not so important to be precise, but that's the scale of it. That's the scale of the challenge. Plus, of course, we would like the economy to grow. Wouldn't that be nice? I'm sure all of you who are coming onto the job market would like to see the economy grow. So we have to account for that, right? We want the economy to grow in absolute terms while energy consumption or CO2 emissions decline in absolute terms. So it's a very, very difficult challenge, and it can be boiled down to these two factors. One factor is the amount of energy used per unit of economic activity. So energy consumption divided by GDP, that's energy intensity. And then the second factor is the rate at which we take carbon out of our energy supply. So those two factors together really make up the challenge. And the calculations that we ran suggest that we need to be doing this at a rate of roughly 7% a year for 40 years. And that's hard because we're really not doing that well right now. So now if you look back, so this chart goes to 2009. Actually, the energy consumption statistics improved a little bit in the last couple of years. But nonetheless, you can see, and these are just scenarios. There's nothing magic about dividing that 7% up between 3% in the one factor and 4% in another. It's just an illustrative scenario. And there are blockages on both sides, but I think the decarbonization challenge is bigger. There's going to be some asymptotic limit to energy intensity. Got to use energy to make things, so there's some limit to that. But what's really important is the total. The total is to hit this 7%. And we're not doing too bad in terms of energy intensity. This is just the US. And I guess I should preface the whole thing by saying we really focused mostly on the domestic challenge, and I'd be happy to go into the reasons why. Obviously, the domestic challenge is not the solution. It's just part of the solution. But it would be a big step forward if the United States took some action in this sphere. And we're looking ahead 40 years. And this is such a problem of such immense scale and immense, both in terms of economic activity, in terms of the pervasiveness of energy in our lives, and in terms of the lifetime of the capital, that we have to get started now. We are building power plants now that are going to be with us in 2050. So we're starting to bake in part of the answer already. What else is in this first chapter? So another thing that we argue is that electricity is the key challenge. We don't go deeply into transportation except to argue that there are no, I think, low enough carbon solutions besides electrification of transportation to get us where we need to go. The same is true. So even if you have very efficient cars, and there are some policies now that will make our cars more efficient, eventually you have more cars, and even with very efficient cars, the carbon dioxide emissions go too high. The same is true with natural gas. In the short run, natural gas is terrific. It replaces very dirty coal. But in the longer run, if you want to account for economic growth, you're going to build a lot of gas plants, and eventually the carbon dioxide emissions will creep back up. So that quote, "Bridge to Nowhere," is from the MIT report on gas. Basically, it's a great transition fuel. The question is, can we make a transition to something else? There's a danger that gas is so cheap that it crowds out lower carbon sources of energy. Biofuels, we make the same kind of argument. Certainly, the biofuels that we have now are not very good from an energy perspective, and what's on the horizon probably isn't good enough if we're going to grow the economy in the meantime. So we argue that we have to focus on electricity. We've got to get electricity right to make this transition, and if we don't, we're not going to get to 80 and 40. So that's chapter 1. A bunch of assumptions that lie behind the argument and suggest why we focus on the electricity sector. So that's the core of the book, is to think about electricity, innovation in electricity, and what does that entail. And it's a complicated thing. So, and this is a very simplistic model of the innovation process, sort of a schematic, and it divides innovation up into 4 phases of increasing scale, and each phase involving different kinds of actors. So the first phase, what we call option creation, I think that's what goes on at Clarkson, goes on in laboratories around the country, in startup companies, people coming up with new ideas. But to get into the energy market, things have to scale, and it costs increasingly more money to scale ideas, and you have to meet ever more stringent competition. You've got to meet the price of, right now, you have to meet the price of gas, depending on the application. And that's risky, that's expensive. And the incumbents are always improving. So the stage 4, improvements in use, well, Exxon is out there doing that. General Electric is out there doing that. So if you want to come up through these earlier phases and compete with the incumbents, that's a very rigorous task. And our argument about the US is that we're pretty good at stage 1. We have a lot of great universities. We have great startup companies. We have venture capitalists. We're pretty good at coming up with ideas. And we're pretty good at the far end in phase 4 in the markets that we have, competitive markets and effective companies. But we're not very good at the middle 2 stages, where public and private interests are sort of mixed together, and you need some co-investment from both sectors. We're not very good at that, and that's where the real challenge lies in the system. So chapter 2 concludes with what we call design criteria. It's a bit of a metaphor, because you really can't design the system perfectly. That would be to ask too much. These systems have to grow up somewhat organically from all the institutions that are part of it. All you can do is create the conditions where that system can emerge. But nonetheless, these are the things that we would like the system to do. So accelerate all the stages. And as I said, we particularly focus on those middle 2 stages, demonstration and early adoption. So showing that the technology or the innovation will work in practice, and then getting early users to adopt it and drive the cost down. Those are 2 stages that our country is not that good at, particularly in the energy area. We believe that effective innovation requires competition, requires new entry. And one of the biggest challenges in energy is that the incumbents are pretty slow, they're pretty uninnovative, and there are some good reasons for that. But this sector needs an infusion of young people's point of view, of new companies, of people who've had success in other areas and bringing their ideas in from elsewhere. So we believe in competition, we believe in entry. There are going to be some big investments, and you have to be able to kill off the investments that don't work. You're going to have failures. That's the nature of innovation. And so you need a system that can, we call it down selection here, that is, kill off the duds and grow the successes. You need a system that's big enough to meet this task. It's an enormous system, the energy system. So you need an investment that's large enough to scale. And finally, and I think the most original stuff in the book is about taking advantage of diversity. We have a very diverse country with lots of different energy options, different preferences across the country, and it's a real resource that we don't take advantage of. We're a little cumbersome, we're a little top-down, and so one of our criteria here is to take advantage of this diversity. And the bottom line right now is that the current energy innovation system doesn't meet these criteria. We are really not succeeding. We don't have a system that is going to be innovative enough to solve the climate challenge. All right, so then we move into the core of the book, and this is sort of the layout from a policy perspective. We just divide the future. We divide the future into 3 waves. The first wave, this decade, we believe the key implementations have to be in the area of efficiency, and that's where the opportunities are. That's where the opportunities to really make a big difference are. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't be working on the other things, but this is where the gains are going to come from in the short run. The second wave, the one that's going to really drive decarbonization of the electricity supply, that's going to come to scale, we think, in the next 3 decades, so between 2020 and 2050. And probably the most controversial assertion in the book is the notion that we need to scale technologies that we basically understand now. We can't premise our policy on some kind of a breakthrough. It would be great to have, so some of you may have read Freeman Dyson's notion that we should genetically engineer trees so that they'll take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere at a rapid pace. Well, that may be a wonderful idea, but I don't think it's going to come to scale even in 40 years. I don't think nuclear fusion is going to come to scale in 40 years. So we need to move forward on systems that we know something about already, because it takes a long, long time for the energy system to evolve. And so this is about evolution and not revolution, and about learning to do what we already know how to do a lot better. And then over the horizon, beyond 2050, perhaps things that we're investing in now at the seed stage, the basic research level, will bear fruit. And so these are the kind of pillars of the book, are these 3 waves. So here are the waves laid out against our 4 phases. So the energy efficiency stuff, most of the technology is here. It's a question of breaking through barriers of organizational nature, breaking through implementation barriers. Low carbon electricity supply, here the challenge is not in the basic research stage, but in scale-up stage, demonstrating new technologies, showing that they'll be cheap enough, showing that they'll work for enough people, be reliable enough to meet the needs. And over the horizon, then, we have things that are just glimmers in your eye right now. Now, one thing that ties together all 3 waves is the structure of the power industry. And this is something that Stephen worked on when he was at Harvard. And it's kind of the ultimate my eyes glaze over subject. You guys know that expression, MIGO, right? My eyes glaze over. It is something I never thought I would get into. And certainly there are plenty of people who know this in great depth. But it seemed to us, if you're talking about energy innovation and you want the private sector to lead, you've got to think about industry structure. And this is most relevant, I would argue, for the second wave, but it's also relevant for the first wave, the energy efficiency wave. We envision a completion of the so-called restructuring process. And basically that means introducing more forces of market competition into the utility sector. Once upon a time, maybe 100 years ago, the electric industry was the way we think of the IT industry today, right, where really bright people gathered to make breakthroughs. Well, it hasn't been that way for a long time. It's become very cumbersome, very conservative, and we need an infusion of new energy. And our conclusion after thinking about this for a long time was the only way to get that infusion of energy would be to decrease the footprint of the utility. So many states, and this is a very complicated picture, in some states, the utilities basically run everything from where the wire comes into your house all the way to the power plant, so-called vertically integrated, regulated states. And then there are other states, and I think New York is one, where they have vertically disintegrated the power system so that there are separate ownership of the power plants from the grid. And what we have in this country is a patchwork framework. And our view was that it was important to introduce competition both at the front end, that is at the generation end, so competition among power plants, and also behind what we call behind the meter, so where customers are using energy. There's still a need to have utilities. There can really only be one set of wires. But what we envision is a system in which you could plug in power plants of a new kind and have them work with the rest of the system. That you could plug in new ways of managing energy behind the meter, whether it's in a place like, well, Clarkson's probably has its own system, it's big enough, but in the home or in the business, to have third parties come in and manage. And we see IT companies coming into the energy management space, and that's a very encouraging sign. So we imagine this new kind of utility, and we borrow the language here from a guy named Peter Fox-Penner, utility consultant, what he calls the smart integrator utility. Its job is to integrate all of these resources on the ends, new kinds of power plants, new kinds of energy management systems. And this is going to be a very challenging thing. It's still going to require a lot of innovation on the part of utilities. But it's not end-to-end control, which they have in most states right now. And it's not regulated to the same degree. So our idea with utilities is to infuse competition into the front end, that is the generation end, and the back end, the management end. And that is going to force innovation in between the people that own the grid. Whoops. All right, so let me talk about now the first wave, energy efficiency. So here, there are tremendous opportunities. Our buildings, in particular, so this chapter focuses especially on buildings, where the vast amount of waste is in our country. And here, actually, there's some encouraging news. We do see a real progress in green buildings. There are a lot of technologies that are out there ready to be implemented. As Steve Selkowitz, who runs the Building Technologies program at Lawrence Berkeley Laboratory, puts it, it's not that like there's low-hanging fruit. There's fruit lying on the ground rotting in buildings. There are tremendous opportunities to just implement new technologies. And so our idea is that this should largely be done through regulation, especially on new buildings. So many parts of the country don't have building energy codes. And the ones that do, they're very effective at making buildings more energy efficient. And if you look at Germany in particular, you see that it can be done. So German buildings and Japanese buildings, very efficient compared to ours. There's no reason why the US can't adopt the technologies that are already successful elsewhere. And the same with appliance standards. We've made a lot of progress with appliance standards. We have to keep pushing down that pathway. The big challenge is retrofitting buildings. So buildings that are already built, they're still going to be around in 2050. And we see, again, some encouraging signs there, new financing models. So for instance, the PACE model, in which a building owner can retrofit their building, and rather than being responsible for the cost if they should sell the building, the cost of that is added in to, well, I should say the loan is paid back through the property tax. So one of the challenges here is that when somebody owns a building and they do the retrofit and then they want to sell the building, they may not get their investment back, and that's a deterrent to improving the building. So the PACE model is a way of ensuring that the money will come back to the investor. Another example here, building labeling. I'm sure all of you are familiar with the MPG sticker that you have on our car, miles per gallon. Well, if you buy a building right now, you don't know what its energy efficiency is. And so people are working on ways to disclose that information in a way that consumers can really understand. So we're encouraged by what's going on in building efficiency. There's still a long ways to go, but there's some exciting news in that area. Second wave, and this is, I think, the most novel feature, as I said, trying to take advantage of the regional opportunities. And I would say the centerpiece of the book is this chapter. So we propose a new set of institutions. And there are a number of pieces to this concept to try to sort of force feed innovation, especially at that demonstration and early adoption stage. So we imagine first taking advantage of the existing societal benefit charges that are placed on many electricity bills already as the funding mechanism, and give that money to a state entity, and that state entity would then choose a set of, it would choose from among a set of regional boards that would in turn fund projects, and those projects would have to be certified by a federal gatekeeper. So this is the epitome of my PowerPoint capabilities. I drew this picture, never thinking we'd get into the book, never thinking we'd get onto a stage this grand. So let me sort of take you through that again. So this is what we imagine this system working. So at the front end, you have electricity users that are paying a charge. We say 2 mils per kilowatt hour. That would raise about $8 billion a year. Then the money goes to a set of state-based trustees. These might be broadly representative organizations, appointees of the governor, appointees of the legislature, something like that. Now, the more important thing is that these entities are not picking projects. They're picking portfolios of projects, which are managed by these regional boards. And maybe the best analogy here is to think about mutual funds. So if you pick a mutual fund, you're not picking individual stocks, you're picking a basket of stocks. And then it's up to the mutual fund itself to pick the individual stocks that you want to own. So, so what we imagine is these regional innovation boards then are being composed of representative of user organizations like utilities, maybe like large-scale industrial users, and they're going to be responsible for picking projects. So we put the users in charge of picking the projects, and then the trustees in charge of picking out which users are going to pick the best projects. And then we have teams of project proposers. Those might be groups of companies. They might involve universities. We imagine all kinds of different projects coming forward, whether they're new kinds of plants, whether they're new ways of managing electricity demand. Maybe there are new ways of organizing the grid. And these teams are going to compete for funding from these regional boards. And then the federal government's role is primarily as a quality control, so what we call the gatekeeper organization, to try to make sure that these regional boards don't get caught up in their own visions of grandeur. And there are plenty of white elephants out there on the energy landscape that have failed because the project managers were unwilling to pull the plug. So we kind of imagine these federal gatekeepers having the guts to pull the plug on projects that don't go well. So the virtue of the system is that it's more bottom-up. There's competition at several stages, both at the investment board stage and also at the project stage. If somebody has a project that they can't succeed with one region, they can try another region. And similarly, we imagine the states being able to, after some startup period to get these boards going, that the states could put their money with a different regional board if they wanted to. So if you're, New York State and you're not happy with the Northeastern board, you can put your money with a different board after a while. So we see competition there as well as at the project level. And it works around many of the, I would say, the defects of the current system, which is very centralized, top-down, and I think beholden to the whims of the Department of Energy in particular. The rest of the system. So it's not all about central power plants. There are other opportunities for innovation in the electricity system. In particular, to take advantage of information and communication technologies in what many people call the smart grid. So a grid that is much more responsive to demand, much more able to bring resources on and to manage intermittent resources like solar and wind power as they cycle in and off. So the second piece of this second wave is to think about those opportunities in distributed generation. And the biggest challenge there is, I would argue, pricing. So we have a number of ideas. Open architecture goes along with the notion of a plug-and-play electricity system. Dynamic pricing simply means some mechanism to match up price with demand. So right now, in most people's case, they get a bill that covers the whole month, and they average the price across the whole month, even though power actually varies in its cost tremendously from day to day or even hour to hour. So right now there's no way for customers to respond to any kind of a price signal, even though we know that a few hours of the year actually account for most of the cost of power. So dynamic pricing, it doesn't have to be fluctuating every second or every minute as some people visualize, but just some mechanism so that the customers are more responsive to price. So some people call this the killer app of the smart grid. Without some form of dynamic pricing, you're really not going to get the kind of investments that we need in these information technologies that are meant to enable flexibility. Cost recovery for hard-to-price services. So the grid owner is going to be doing a lot of things that are difficult to see, assuring quality, assuring reliability, bringing to bear IT expertise, and they're going to have to be compensated for that, and that's going to pose a number of challenges. And we envision that some of these projects in the smart grid area can also be encompassed in the system of regional innovation investment boards that I talked about a moment ago. All right, and then last, so over the horizon, I would say, my colleague, my co-author is from MIT, so the last chapter winds being probably more homage to MIT than it should be, so I'll blame it on him. But we know that this challenge isn't going to go away in 2050. I mean, we should be so lucky to get to 80% reduction in 2050, but even then there's going to be new challenges. There are going to be new things that arise, so we have to keep investing, sowing the seed corn, and creating new options that can come to scale sometime beyond the horizon. And so we're encouraged by the creation of the Advanced Research Project Agency for Energy, so-called ARPA-E. This is a government agency that really has broken some of the rules that government agencies have historically lived by, tried to invest in things that are a little beyond the horizon, and also to invest in technologies that are commercializable, not just basic research, but actually on the ground applications. But these breakthrough options have to be carried out in a different kind of environment, a more open environment than the technologies that we're hoping to see commercialized in the shorter run. So to sum it all up in a nutshell, and I've probably given you more than you could absorb in 40 minutes. This is what we see as the key pieces of a new energy innovation system that can meet the challenges of the 21st century. So the first thing that we need is new players. We need young people to come in. We need companies to enter this sector from other industries, especially from the IT world, that are more nimble, that are more creative than the players that are in it now. In order to enable that, I think we need expanded competition. So that was the notion of restructuring, completing the restructuring process in the utility sector. What that implies for the utility is this smart integrator. So this is a company that owns the wires and has to manage all these innovators on the edges of the system and package it all together so that it operates. It's a very stringent challenge. Energy efficiency, marketplace, invigorate that, have new funding opportunities. We put forward this multi-part notion of regional capabilities and enabling those through the regional innovation investment boards, the trustees, the gatekeeper agency. To really accelerate smart grid innovation, we need dynamic pricing of some sort, as I said, not necessarily second by second, but some connection between the prices that consumers pay and their behavior. Opening up the grid architecture, encouraging customers to control their own energy management. And then finally, a larger, and I don't really go into the scale, we need to make bigger investments in energy R&D. This is probably the most pedestrian recommendation, along with carbon pricing. We're not against carbon pricing. I think that has to be part of it too. But a lot of people have called for this, and we agree with them. But we think it needs to be linked to a broader overhaul of the innovation system. So let me leave it there, take your questions, try to clarify some of the points that I made, and hear your criticisms. And thanks for listening.
We're going to open the floor to questions, and if you can come on up to the microphone, just like that. Perfect.
So you said earlier that you thought the smart integrators would function to glue these new energy creators and new forms of consuming energy together, and that they would be forced to upgrade their transmission facilities, et cetera. Around here, we've got a wind power project that was, I think it's Galoo Island. And the problem was there was, the company was more than happy to generate the electricity. They had no way to get it off the island. And there was no way to build the power transmission facilities because NIMBYs were like, no. So I dare I suggest, and please try, I want you to talk me out of this, let me suggest that smart integrators are not going to be forced to improve. They're going to act as the brake, and they're going to prevent innovation on both sides.
Well, it doesn't sound like, maybe I didn't understand your scenario, but it didn't sound like it was the integrator that was the challenge there. It was the people who are controlling the rights to the right of way. And there's no question that that's a challenge, especially out west where we're talking about long power lines going across public lands, some of which are fragile. And I do think that maybe some additional power will need to be granted to allow those rights of way to go through. And I think there are a number of court cases kind of underway to do that. So I agree. I don't think the utility may need some additional support from the coercive power of government to get those lines through. I do think transmission is a challenge. We're congested already. We're stuck, with 20th century infrastructure, and some investment is going to need to be made from the public side to make that happen. So I think you're hitting on a key bottleneck.
I have lots of questions, but one of the things that I didn't hear when we think about all these alternatives, and so wind and solar are closest when you think is probably. It takes a lot of material goods to create enough solar panels and wind turbines and all of the infrastructure around that. Can we begin to hit an 80 by 50 with the material goods we have, the precious metals, even just the aluminum? Is there enough material goods to meet these energy goals?
Yeah. Well, I have to say we haven't drilled down to that level of analysis, and I wouldn't put it all on wind and solar. I think we envision nuclear being part of the mix as well, and maybe carbon capture and storage if that can be scaled up. So I think there are going to be challenges of many kinds, and that'll include water, that'll include raw materials, and we're going to need innovations to solve those problems as well. So I don't think I have a comprehensive answer to that question, but I guess I envision markets doing most of the work to solve many of those challenges. Steve's ready to ask questions in reserve here, so we need some students to step forward and tell me what you.
Well, I'm not a student. I teach
Great.
Alternative energy at SUNY Canton. But I'm interested. I'm not a policy analyst, and I don't even play one on TV. But I am interested in how the market incentives can actually be reworked to work against what they're now what's producing now. That graph you showed of carbon, there's a little bit of decarbonization of fuel, but there's no reduction. And there may be a reduction even at per dollar of GDP, but we're not reducing our energy consumption. We're not reducing our energy consumption any place in the world. In fact, European Union put together that piece as efficiency sufficient. that was talked about this whole policy. What is it that's going to make, because you know the market's going to, if the market has an incentive to get to zero, we won't use any energy at all, but they don't have any incentive to get there.
Yeah. Well, I do think raising the price of existing energy sources is part of the answer. And whether that's carbon tax, whether that's cap and trade, I think that has to be phased in over time. But at the same time, I think we have to bring the price of new technologies down. So we need both a pull and a push. What's that? Well, we need these kind of large-scale investments in demonstration and in early adoption, where there are some benefits to the customer, but also some benefits to the public. And so that that provides a rationale to provide some subsidies to the customer. And I think the answer is to work at both ends at the same time and try to harness that power of markets. But this is a tough challenge. I mean, energy is cheap right now, and I don't think we're gonna beat the current price of fossil-based fuel without some regulation at the same time that we accelerate innovation in the alternatives.
For dynamic pricing to have some value in the types of things you're looking at, it actually has to be able to change people's behavior.
Yeah.
Which means in some sense you're going to have to charge until it hurts. Do you actually think that we can put together the necessary social structure behind that to make sure that the folks that you are hurting are not the ones that can least afford to be hurt? In other words,
yeah.
It's easy to change the behavior of the person who can't very well pay their electric bill, but the guy who has the 6,000 square foot home, who, because electricity is so cheap, can you even begin to think that you could get prices up high enough to make him do something to be energy efficient? How do you balance those and prevent the social
I don't think the only way to change behavior is to raise prices. And in fact, I think that dynamic price signal could encourage a lot of people to save money. And I think the experiments that have been done recently show that most people do save money because they know when it's expensive and when it's cheap. But there's going to have to be some accommodation made for people, who have medical equipment that has to operate all the time, that have special needs. So, I think there's going to have to be some way to accommodate people that are going to be hurt by that. But my impression of the evidence is that dynamic pricing actually cuts people's bills by and large. And so it's not the blunt hammer. I mean, what I was talking about in response to the earlier question, the price of energy as a whole rising, that is a kind of blunt hammer that's going to cost people more. But dynamic pricing overall, I think, is going to bring bills down, and it's going to help avoid a lot of investment because much of the investment is on the margin when you need that peak power. And so the opportunity here is to get rid of that marginal investment and lower the system costs as well.
I can ask questions all night. Just form a line. If you want to ask questions, come.
Yeah, please do. Please do. I know I went through a lot of stuff really fast, so I would be happy to answer questions that feel like, everybody else knows the answer. Probably not. So great. Thank you for encouraging that.
So can I hear you say that ethanol has been a disaster?
I didn't say it in so many words,
No, you didn't.
but
Can
I don't
hear
think
you?
it's been a success.
Okay.
And I don't think it's going to meet our CO2 challenge.
No.
And I don't even think it's very good for the land or for the food markets.
For food markets
Yeah.
particularly, yeah. We're burning food. That's insane. Anyway, the other question is,
Yeah.
You need to talk to some of the GMU economists because if you make energy, or if you make energy use more efficient, that encourages greater use of energy.
Yeah. Yeah, so that's the so-called rebound effect. And that is a real effect, although there are different estimates of what it is. And I think my impression is on the margin, the marginal consumption dollar goes into things that are less energy intensive. So we're still making a gain. But yeah, that is something to consider. And it depends on the particular context. But sure, you make a good point, and if you cut demand, price goes down, and there's an effect of that for sure. Go ahead.
From the policy standpoint, when you mention your form work where you have picking portfolios of projects that naturally there are going to be some losers.
Yeah.
How do you think that plays out? I mean, we saw what happened when Solyndra went bankrupt
Yeah.
and so from a political standpoint,
Yeah.
how do you enable that? How do you make sure that things don't happen like that again?
Yeah, well, they're going to happen again. I mean, so I wish I could solve the political problem, and of course I'm a political scientist, and that's the one thing I really don't know what the answer is. I think we're going to need a policy system that can cope with failures, and you know, there were some successes and some failures in the stimulus, and that was to be expected. And you know, I do think having a system with some competition and some layers to it will buffer some of those failures. But they're going to be there, and that's the nature of innovation, especially innovation on a large scale. And we want to be able to, you know, identify those early and kill them, but not avoid them. So hopefully we can generate some measures of success that, you know, that go beyond the easy pickings that we see in the media. But I am concerned the way the public attitude and the public debate is going. I don't think it's going in a positive direction in that regard.
I'm actually just a freshman here, but I just want to ask about the more the long-term solutions. You're talking about the stuff that is in the beginning stages right now. The stuff that you're talking about, not the third wave solutions, fusion, the artificial
Photosynthesis.
photosynthesis. Thank you. Which of those do you think is actually one of the more practical, in your opinion?
I'm not the right person to ask on that. So that's where my colleague, who's the MIT engineer, can answer the question. And you can't ask a political scientist, you know, what the answer is. I certainly think it's to be discovered. You know, I think the answer is we're not going to know until we try stuff out. And we need to plant a lot of seeds and see which ones grow. Certainly, it would be a mistake to try to figure out now, you know, without the benefit of real investment and putting great minds to work on it to guess at this stage.
Well, there has already been some investment into fusion. They're actually
Yeah.
working on the first generation of reactors that they're not in the positive of energy production, but they're mostly about testing. They're not actually trying to produce energy from them. They're more about testing.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I
trying to
will
get more
opine slightly
efficient.
on fusion. I'm somewhat skeptical of fusion for the reasons that you described. Somebody said fusion is 50 years off and it's always going to be that way. So, you know, I'm a little bit skeptical of that one, simply because it is very difficult to make it work and to make it a payoff in an energy sense.
Yeah, I mean,
So my colleague is my co-author is the chairman of the MIT Nuclear Engineering Department, and his favorite is small modular reactors. So if he was here, I'm sure he would give you the defense of that one.
And I probably talked to him for the rest of the hour about that.
Yeah, yeah.
I know like there are like companies, well, actually governments are providing a lot of incentives for like the companies and households to like be more energy efficient. So I was wondering, like, are any banks like helping, major banks like helping out to finance, to invest a little bit in this? I know like in Germany they have a company called the bank is actually called the DEG,
Yeah.
supporting to for the energy
Yeah.
efficiency. So I was wondering if there's any bank here in U.S. to help that out, or if there's none, is there any way to kind of like can excite the banks to provide such incentive or such investment to help the environment?
Yeah, so I think what we see is innovation on a small scale in this regard. A lot of different kinds of structures being tried out. I mentioned PACE, which is really usually intermediated through the state or local government, but it could be a bank. And basically, the state could use its low cost way of raising money, channel that to through banks or through other financial institutions to homeowners to make the investment in energy efficiency, improving their houses, and then paying it back in association with the tax bill to make sure that it definitely will get paid back. So we see innovation like that. We see, I mean, it's kind of a acronym soup, ESAs, PPAs, ESCOs, and so on. So we see a lot of creativity being applied. The problem has been getting it to a large enough scale. And quite frankly, we've seen some regulators, especially in the housing industry, blocking innovations that could move things forward. So, so there are some opportunities. We see some investors taking an interest in this. I mean, I think the bigger action has been on renewables, you know, the so-called power purchasing agreement. I think somebody mentioned there's one here at Clarkson.
So do you think like companies like say like GE, like big manufacture for some
Yeah.
like reactors or something like that. Do you think there would be eventually be well incentive like be?
I think they have to be part of it, and we do see that with some control equipment manufacturers providing some of the financing. But ultimately, I think we'll need outside financing as well. I don't think those OEMs can do it all, but they can be part of the solution. And part of it is creating vehicles for private investors to come in and get some of the gains. So we have a situation in which there are capital demand, right? People need capital to make these kind of investments, and we need to create mechanisms for capital providers to come in and supply some of that.
You spoke about how you think most of the sustainable technologies are already here, and it's a matter of the public implementing them. Would you then discourage a technical student to pursue research or a career in sustainable technologies?
No, I didn't mean to say that. I guess what I mean to say is that innovation in the energy sector takes a long time, and there's innovations all along the way. So just because we know the basic engineering and scientific characteristics of something like PV solar doesn't mean that all the work is done. There's going to be a lot more work in figuring out how to mass produce it, how to install it at a low cost. So there's something that the federal government is carrying out now called, now I'm blanking on the name of it. It's not Sunshot. Maybe you can help me here, Chuck. Anyway, to try to kind of create a race for the lowest installable solar unit. You know, just because you can make the modules cheap in a factory doesn't mean they're cheap to install. So there's a lot of innovation to be done in technologies where the basic engineering characteristics are already known. So, you know, sustainable technology is a very, very big concept, and I guess I would encourage you to think about innovation in a broad way. And I had a chance to meet with the folks from the Technology Innovation Center here today, and I thought it was really exciting the way they're thinking about innovation. It's not just about the widget, but it's about taking the widget and making it useful for lots of people. And that requires business innovation, that requires innovation in production. And also, like I said, I think there are opportunities to continue to push the frontiers of knowledge, and there's room for that as well. So I wouldn't discourage you from any of those things. There's going to be plenty of opportunity to put minds to use in whatever aspect of innovation you want to work in.
Thank you.
Yeah, so don't be discouraged. That would be the worst outcome of this talk. Anyway, yeah.
Do you think a down selection process whose purpose is to push out poor performing technologies has the potential instead to push out more efficient but less profitable technologies?
Yeah, that's a good question. It depends on who's doing the selecting. And our vision is you would have a sort of floor set by this federal gatekeeping agency. And then it's going to be ultimately up to the boards to decide. And our vision of these boards is that the users are going to be the dominant voice. So hopefully that would encourage a longer term perspective on this. But I think that that's a danger. And I think it's a good point. And this is one of those things where the devil will be in the details to try to make sure that the benefits are, that these technologies that get selected are improvable over the long run. Yeah, that's a good point.
All right, so of the technologies that you see available today, we have some that we know are going to carry through we want to carry through 2050. Solar comes to mind, hydro, wind, and we know that there are some we want to, you know, phase out or at least minimize by 2050.
Yeah.
Where do you see nuclear in that?
Where do I see nuclear?
Yeah.
I think nuclear has to be part of the solution myself. I just think we need baseload power. I've come a long ways on this question over 30 years. So, you know, when I was a kid, we had 3 Mile Island. And then we had Chernobyl. I was a little older by then, but those were very discouraging events. And I'm afraid that Fukushima has had some of that effect on the current generation. And there's no question that there are some dangers with nuclear. I just think the dangers are greater with the climate warming the way it is. So I think nuclear has to be part of the portfolio. And I think the record in the US is pretty impressive. Doesn't mean it won't be shattered tomorrow, but I hope not. And there are some real challenges. We were talking about nuclear waste today with a couple of colleagues, and that hasn't been solved. So my first job out of college was siting of a nuclear waste repository. And 30 years later, we're basically back to where we were when I started that job. So that's discouraging, and it hasn't been solved, although much of that has to do with the problem that you brought up, which was the NIMBY not in my backyard challenge. So I think it's part of the solution, and boy, I just wonder where Germany's going to be 10 years from now when they close their fleet of reactors, and more power to them if they can make their system work, but I have a feeling they're going to be importing power from France, which generates most of it through nuclear, and not to mention coal generation from elsewhere.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. My question is, how does the U.S. How does the U.S. manage investment in foreign innovation?
Yeah. Well, that's a great question, and we didn't really take it on in the book, I have to say. We tried to focus on the domestic scene, but clearly there are probably greater opportunities abroad. Certainly, if you're thinking about scaling technologies right now, the place to be is China, not the US. And we see American companies investing for good reason in improving their technologies there. And I think we need to be reaping the benefits of those investments here. So there's lots of knowledge being generated abroad, and we need to better improve our system to absorb that knowledge, because we still have a bit of the so-called NIH complex not invented here in the US. So I would like to see more collaboration and more cooperation, and I think it's going to be an important part of the path forward. And probably, for many of these scaling processes, they have to be done at a global level, and the US has to be part of that picture. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I was wondering if, even though it's very important for all these new energy processes, if there's a chance that people who depend on like fossil fuel industries, like companies, could lose their jobs, or like a significant amount of those people could lose their jobs, and people that aren't very skilled, that need those jobs to feed their families, will these new types of energy, like the possibilities that come from it, like new companies, could those same people work, just with a new type of...
Yeah, no, I think it's a good point. I think there are going to be people that that have made their lives around existing industries, and I think this is part of the life cycle of capitalism, that industries rise, industries fall, and the magic of it is that those skills do ultimately get reabsorbed in other opportunities, whether it's in the same, whether it's in energy or someplace else. And I wish our government did more to facilitate that. I think we can invest more in training. I think we can invest more in helping people manage those transitions, because they're coming more frequently. But there's going to be people that lose out of this. And I think one of the problems that the administration has had in recent years is overselling the job angle on green energy. There may be jobs created, but there are also going to be jobs destroyed. And I think we have to be honest about that.
It was mentioned that electrification of transportation might be one of the most effective short-term ways to reduce our nation's carbon footprint. Considering that much of the country still receives their power from fossil fuel burning power plants, some kind of alternate energy development method has to be used, wind, solar, and to touch on the nuclear aspect, which way do you think might be most effective to replenish that?
So I didn't mean to say that it was a short-run process. This is a long-term process, the electrification of transportation, and it obviously has to proceed in conjunction with decarbonization of the electricity generation. So those things have to go in parallel, otherwise there's no point. Otherwise you're just making transportation a lot less efficient from an energy point of view than it is now. It's all of the above. I think it will be nuclear. I think it will be renewables. Maybe there'll be CCS on fossil plants. So my guess is a little bit of everything. And I think the beauty of the regional approach is we'll see different things flower in different places. Our country has different kinds of resources in different places. It also has different public perceptions. So the South is much more supportive of nuclear than the rest of the country. So why not expand the nuclear industry there? Why not expand the solar industry in the Southwest, where it actually, where the sun shines most of the time, rather than up here where it's a little cloudier? So I think we will see all those. If it's to be successful, we have to see all those things move forward. Yeah. The last thing we want is coal-powered cars. I totally agree with you on that.
So I was wondering how much you looked at the global aspect of this, and tried to figure out whether there was anything the U.S. could learn if they actually looked, since they don't look that way.
So that's the one piece of the global aspect we did. We did look at things that we could learn from abroad. I mentioned the German energy efficiency law, and somebody, earlier questioner brought up financing. So Germany has a very successful state-level system for financing energy efficiency that's run through the state government. So we did look for models abroad. What we didn't do is kind of think of the global integration. So our vision is like, the U.S. needs to take some leadership here. We're the biggest, one of the biggest on a per capita basis energy consumers. And certainly there are going to be global dimensions to these markets, global dimensions to these technological opportunities. But the U.S., I think, needs to be out in front on some of these things to be effective as a global leader of the whole response. So,
But don't they need to catch up before they can get ahead?
yeah, fair enough. No, that's why I think there are models abroad, especially in efficiency, where we're way behind, and we can learn from other countries. So the building codes are an example. We see those abroad. The financing mechanisms, we see those abroad. So I think there are plenty of ways for us to learn. Although it's hard to package that in Washington. So we have to think that they're homegrown, even if they're borrowed. But learning from the states, I mean, that's another thing, to go back to the regional theme. A lot of states are doing a lot of interesting things that could be, scaled up to the national level. And, so we have learning to do internally as well as internationally.
So I liked your presentation.
Oh, thanks.
First off. Is that a little bit too loud? So I have two questions. I'll start with the shorter one.
Okay.
So these energy mutual funds that you're talking about,
yeah,
will they be similar to investments where there'll be an exit fee for those who decide to switch from one to the next because one's failing or one's better than the other? And then my second one is I know one of the top goals was behavioral change. I feel like a lot of the points that you outlined in the different waves is kind of like a top-down and a market-driven energy behavioral change. And I'm wondering if that's the best way about going about it, or if a new level of understanding about human beings in their place in the environment, how we should foster the environment to sustain our personal societal growth is a better approach.
Okay. So number one, I meant the metaphor, the mutual fund idea as a metaphor. They aren't literally mutual funds that individuals can invest in, but the states would be investing in these things, and then they're packaging together the projects. So there are just a number of layers to the investment project. So you have these boards that are picking individual projects, whether they're power plants, whether they're smart grid demonstrations. So each of the boards is going to have a portfolio, and that looks like a mutual fund. And then the states will decide which of these boards that they want to invest in. So you have one layer that's picking projects, and then the next layer is picking groups of projects or portfolios of projects. But it's not an individual level investment, it's really a collective investment by society. So this funding is coming from ratepayers or from all of us. And it could come from a carbon tax. I mean, I'm not fixated on putting a charge on electricity to pay for it, but you need some steady stream of funding that's not subject to the vagaries of the federal appropriations process, for instance. So the beauty of charging on the electric bill is that that's going to be a steady flow of funds. And then that comes to these state trustees, and then they pick portfolios of projects. So it's not at the individual level. Second question, I would really like people to have a transformed mindset, but I think that takes even longer than 40 years. Let's say we're 40 years or 50 years into it, if you want to date the beginning of the environmental movement to Silent Spring, 1962, so it's the 50th anniversary of that. It takes a long time to change people's minds. I think market incentives work a lot more quickly, and our system is still fundamentally built around those. To a great extent, I don't want to, there are other things that drive people. There's religion, there's education, there's the values of neighborhoods and so on. But I don't think we can count on those the same way. And I think that's an important part of the story, but I don't think it's going to get us all the way there. So, I'd like to see that, but I don't believe that it will happen. Yeah. I mean, I remember talking about this as an undergraduate. What we really need is a new religion. It hasn't happened yet, at least not that kind of religion.
Hey, so you talked about the gridlock domestically and internationally and how energy policy hasn't really gone anywhere the past year. So how do you plan to get some of these energy policies that you're talking about in play?
Right, so I'm involved in our follow-up projects is to try to build some of these regional capabilities and to try to work, we're working with a group called Advanced Energy Economies, which is a regionally based set of sort of economic development organizations and companies, and to try to work from the bottom up. I think the opportunity right now is to work from the bottom up, work through the state. I mean, New York State is doing some innovative things from what I understand. New England is, California is. Colorado, where I'm from, is. So I think the opportunity is to work at the state level. And, you know, I think eventually, I keep saying this, eventually things will change in Washington and the opportunity will reemerge there. But I think for right now, the real innovative agents are at a lower level of government.
Hi. So I heard about, you mentioned the rebound effect, and actually I took notes, so hopefully I have a pretty good idea of what it is, even though it isn't in my, my realm of expertise per se. But if we were to increase efficiency, that would mean that people would likely induce, it would induce basically a social change such that people use more energy because carbon, you know, is cheaper. And so if this were to happen, though, I would think that the large systematic infrastructural changes which you suggest might erode because we know that, you know, public opinion and things like that has some type of cyclic effect on infrastructural change because through politics, that kind of general consensus in some cases is propagated through, right? So how do we, and I would ask that you suggest maybe a couple practical ways, how do we insulate those changes, insulate this transitional wave system that you have from possible kind of social changes or socio-political effects? I guess it's a general question.
Well, so I mean, this goes back to where's the political coalition behind this? And you know, Richard told me that was my job. He would take care of the engineering, and I just had to take care of the politics. And I'm afraid I'm the one who failed in the project because, you know, I think it has to build over time. I think we do see some encouraging signs. We see people coming out of the evangelical Christian movement saying, hey, there is a question of planetary stewardship. So some of the rhetoric is changing, and I think it's going to come from a diverse set of sources. We see it also with people concerned about environmental justice. So some of those pieces are there, but it hasn't congealed yet behind a program. So I wish I had the answer in terms of the political coalition, but I don't think we're there yet. In terms of the rebound effect, I guess I wouldn't exaggerate it. So imagine it this way. So you're saving a certain amount of money on your electricity bill. And then the question is, how much of that increment that you saved are you going to spend on more electricity? Right. And I think the evidence is only a small portion, at least at this point. Now, you know, if we have tremendous efficiency gains, then we could have bigger rebound effects. But I guess my view is let's cross that bridge when we get to it. And, you know, maybe we do have to impose taxes to bring the prices up and use those taxes for something productive. But I don't think we're at the point of really facing that challenge yet. So it's out there. I think we're aware of it. There is some debate about how big it is, but my impression is it's not that big at this point.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
We're about at the end of our time for the formal meeting, and then we'll have lots of time to talk with David afterwards. For those of you who I haven't met, I'm Chuck Thorpe, and now my job description is to work for Tony and to do anything that he asks me to do. Last year, I had the privilege of sitting right next to David in the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. I'm a grungy robotics guy, so when I ran across something I didn't understand, I would lean over and say, David, what does sequestration mean? And he would say, well, you talking about the engineering carbon capture type, or are you talking about the financial type? Both.
And my answer was, you really don't want to know. Better not to know.
And now we found out.
Yeah.
It was a special pleasure to sit next to someone as clear thinking and as clear as explaining as David, and I should note, as clear as writing. Hold up your book, David.
Oh.
Copies are on sale outside. I had my copy delivered by Amazon. It took me 3 evenings to read. It is a wonderful, clear, more detailed description of everything that we've seen today. So thank you, David, for coming and speaking. I think we should make this the first annual David Hart Lecture. Bring him back next year to talk about policy and immigration. Bring him back the following year to talk about policy and manufacturing. Bring him back the following year to talk about whatever his next book is. Thank you very much, David.
Thank you. Thank you.
Now it's party time.
All right. So somebody has to tell